Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War history. This one's a little personal for me. The person profiled in this video is one of the Confederates I admire the most. He was a true soldier that did his duty, shunned politics, and was not afraid to express his feelings. Most Civil War generals are remembered for the battles they led, but this general is remembered for how he saw them. A brilliant engineer, a master of artillery, and one of the most insightful voices of the Confederacy. This general wasn't just a soldier, he was a strategist, a writer, and later a diplomat. Today, we'll explore the remarkable life of E. Porter Alexander, from his early days at West Point to the thunder of Gettysburg, and finally to his post-war role helping resolve international disputes. His story is one of intellect, resilience, and a legacy that still shapes how we understand the Civil War today. Porter Alexander was born on May 26, 1835, in Washington, Georgia, into a wealthy and distinguished Southern family. He was the sixth of 10 children of Adam Leopold Alexander and Sarah Hillhouse Gilbert Alexander. His mother was the granddaughter of Sarah Porter Hillhouse, the first female editor and printer in the United States. Alexander received a well-rounded education and entered the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1853, graduating third in his class in 1857. His early military career included teaching engineering and fencing at West Point and working on weapons experiments. He also assisted Major Albert J. Meyer in developing the wig-wag signal flag system, which became an essential communication tool during the Civil War. When Georgia seceded from the Union in 1861, Alexander resigned his U.S. Army commission and joined the Confederate Army as a captain of engineers. His decision was likely influenced by loyalty to his home state and the Southern cause, rather than political ambition. At the start of the war, Alexander joined the Confederate Army as a captain of engineers. He quickly became involved in signal operations, making history at the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861 by using wig-wag signal flags to warn Confederate forces of an approaching Union attack. His timely communication helped turn the tide of battle. Alexander was later promoted to Chief of Ordnance for the Army of Northern Virginia, managing supplies and ammunition. He also conducted intelligence gathering, working with spies and observation balloons to track Union movements. Edward Porter Alexander was well known and respected for keen leadership qualities and diverse knowledge of artillery strategy and battlefield intelligence. His service was marked by innovation, leadership, and critical decision-making in some of the war's most significant battles. He garnered nothing but praise from both peers, subordinates, and his leadership. By 1862, Alexander transitioned into the artillery command, serving under General James Longstreet. During the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, Alexander's artillery placements on Marye's Heights devastated Union forces, contributing to a decisive Confederate victory. At the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, Alexander positioned artillery at Hazel Grove, helping Stonewall Jackson's flank attack succeed. Of course, perhaps his pinnacle occurred during the Battle of Gettysburg. Alexander was responsible for coordinating the Confederate artillery bombardment during the entire battle. However, he is perhaps best known for his coordination of the artillery barrage preceding Pickett's charge. He positioned 75 cannons along Seminary Ridge, aiming to weaken the Union defenses on Cemetery Ridge. However, due to poor visibility from smoke and miscalculations in range, many Confederate shells overshot their targets, failing to disable the Union artillery. Additionally, the inability for the mixed Confederate commands to effectively coordinate the barrage further complicated the action. Edward Porter Alexander and General William N. Pendleton, the Army of Northern Virginia's Chief of Artillery, had a complex relationship during the Civil War, particularly regarding artillery command in the Army of Northern Virginia. Pendleton was technically Alexander's superior, but Alexander was widely regarded as the more competent artillery officer. Alexander respected Pendleton's rank, but he was critical of his abilities as an artillery commander. Pendleton, a former Episcopal minister, lacked practical battlefield experience, and his leadership was often seen as ineffective. Alexander believed that Pendleton's organizational skills were weak, and that he failed to properly coordinate artillery resources during key battles such as Gettysburg. One of the most notable instances of friction between the two occurred just prior to Pickett's charge. Pendleton was nominally in charge of the Confederate artillery, but Alexander was given direct control over the bombardment preceding Pickett's charge. Alexander was promised 6 field howitzers to accompany the infantry to direct fire support during the long march across the field. Pendleton was to loan these howitzers to Alexander for his use. Just prior to stepping off, the howitzers were nowhere to be found, and Pendleton provided no assistance in finding them. Alexander was ultimately responsible for coordinating the Confederate artillery fire to weaken Union defenses on Cemetery Ridge, and without those howitzers, he could not support the mobile infantry. The bombardment did not achieve its intended effect. Many Confederate shells overshot their targets, and Union artillery remained largely intact. As a result, when Pickett's men advanced, they faced devastating Union artillery fire, leading to the failure of the charge. The 6 field howitzers were likely expended in the bombardment, firing their rounds before the infantry assault began. Given the chaotic nature of the battle, they may have been withdrawn, abandoned, or captured as Confederate forces retreated after the failed charge. While Alexander respected Pendleton's position, their relationship was strained, and Alexander often had to work around Pendleton's limitations to ensure effective artillery operations. After the war, Alexander was diplomatic in his writings, but still expressed frustration with Pendleton's poor decision-making. He believed that Pendleton's shortcomings contributed to the Confederate artillery failures in several battles. Regardless, Pickett's charge was moving forward. General James Longstreet, also skeptical of the attack's success, delegated the decision to Alexander on whether the infantry should advance. Alexander was reluctant, but ultimately sent word to General George Pickett, telling him to begin the charge. He later regretted this, realizing that the Union artillery had conserved ammunition and was ready to fire on the advancing Confederate troops. As Pickett's men marched across the open field, Union artillery devastated their ranks, leading to massive Confederate casualties. Alexander watched helplessly as the attack collapsed, unable to provide further artillery support due to low ammunition. The failure of Pickett's charge marked the turning point of the Battle of Gettysburg and the beginning of the end for the Confederate Army. Alexander later reflected on the flaws in the attack, criticizing Lee's decision to strike the Union center and lamenting the lack of coordination in the Confederate artillery strategy. Edward Porter Alexander was a key player in the execution of Pickett's charge, and his artillery bombardment had several flaws that contributed to the failure of the attack. First, the misjudgment of Union artillery damage. Alexander believed that his bombardment would cripple Union artillery, but in reality, many Union batteries had conserved ammunition and were still fully operational when the Confederate infantry advanced. Second, overshooting targets. Due to poor visibility from smoke and miscalculations in range, many Confederate shells overshot their targets, landing behind Union lines instead of silencing enemy guns. Some Confederate artillerists blamed this on the poor quality of the fuses in their ammunition. Another key detractor was the lack of ammunition reserves. Alexander had limited ammunition and was unable to sustain the bombardment or provide effective support once Pickett's men were engaged in combat. Finally, the delegation of infantry attack decision. Longstreet delegated the decision to launch the charge to Alexander, putting him in an uncomfortable position. Alexander was reluctant, but ultimately gave the order, later regretting it when he realized that Union artillery was still intact. These flaws, combined with Lee's miscalculations in ordering the charge, led to disastrous Confederate losses. Alexander later reflected on the attack, stating that Lee had never bollocksed a fight as he did this. Edward Porter Alexander had strong post-war reflections on Gettysburg, particularly regarding Pickett's charge. In his memoirs, he was highly critical of the attack, believing it was doomed from the start. Alexander regretted his role in the decision-making, as Longstreet had delegated the final call on whether to proceed with the charge to him. He felt trapped in the moment, knowing the attack was unlikely to succeed, but unable to stop it. He later admitted that he had tried to avoid the responsibility, but ultimately gave the order to advance. In his book, Military Memoirs of a Confederate, published in 1907, Alexander provided a detailed analysis of the battle, offering insightful critiques of Confederate strategy. His personal recollections, published posthumously in 1989 as Fighting for the Confederacy, further expanded on his frustrations with Lee's decisions and the flaws in the Confederate artillery strategy. Edward Porter Alexander was one of the most candid critics of Confederate leadership in the aftermath of the Civil War. Unlike many former Confederate officers who embraced the lost cause narrative, Alexander took an analytical approach, evaluating military decisions based on strategy rather than sentiment. His post-war writings provided a unique perspective on the flaws in Confederate command, particularly the decisions made by Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, and Jubal Early. Despite his deep respect for General Robert E. Lee, Alexander was critical of some of Lee's battlefield decisions, especially at Gettysburg. He believed Lee's miscalculations on July 3, 1863, in ordering Pickett's charge was one of the greatest mistakes. He felt that Lee misjudged Union defenses, launching an attack that was doomed from the start. Beyond Gettysburg, Alexander also viewed Lee's decision to fight at Antietam as his most significant blunder, arguing that the battle placed the Confederate Army in an untenable position that nearly led to its destruction. Alexander's relationship with General James Longstreet was complex. While he admired Longstreet's tactical abilities, he believed his hesitancy at Gettysburg weakened Confederate chances for success. Alexander was particularly frustrated by Longstreet's delays on July 2nd, which allowed Union forces to strengthen their positions before the Confederate attack. Despite these criticisms, Alexander also defended Longstreet from post-war attempts to shift blame for the defeat, arguing that Lee's strategy, not Longstreet's actions, was the primary cause of the failure. Furthermore, Alexander was highly critical of General Jubal Early, who became one of the leading voices behind the Lost Cause movement following the end of the war. Early aggressively defended Lee's leadership while placing blame on Longstreet for Confederate failures. Alexander disagreed with Early's revisionist history, believing it distorted the truth to protect Lee's legacy. Instead, Alexander sought to provide a balanced assessment, acknowledging both the strengths and the weaknesses of Confederate leadership. Beyond individual leaders, Alexander questioned the overall Confederate strategy. He argued that the South should have focused on a defensive war, using its home field advantage rather than launching large-scale invasions into Union territory. He believed Lee's aggressive tactics, while bold, ultimately wore down Confederate resources and sealed the South's defeat. His post-war analysis provides one of the most insightful evaluations of Confederate failures, offering rare, unfiltered perspectives on why the war ended as it did. After the Civil War, Edward Porter Alexander transitioned into a successful career as a railroad executive, educator, and author. His post-war life was marked by scholarly contributions and business ventures, making him one of the most influential Confederate veterans in the late 19th century. Alexander briefly taught civil and military engineering at the University of South Carolina, but he soon moved into the railroad industry, where he became a prominent executive, serving as the superintendent of the Columbia and Augusta Railroad, president of the Savannah and Memphis Railroad, and member of the Georgia Capital Commission. In addition to his business ventures, Alexander was appointed by President Grover Cleveland in 1897 to help resolve border disputes between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, showcasing his diplomatic skills. The dispute centered on the interpretation of the 1858 Canas Juarez Treaty, which defined the boundary between the two nations along the San Juan River. While the treaty granted Nicaragua sovereignty over the river, it also allowed Costa Rica certain navigation rights. However, ambiguities in the treaty's language led to recurring tension over the exact demarcation of the border and the extent of Costa Rica's rights. Alexander was tasked with issuing a binding arbitration to clarify these issues. He spent nearly 3 years in Greytown, Nicaragua, carefully studying historical documents, maps, and legal arguments presented by both sides. On May 30th, 1897, he issued his first arbitral award, which included a detailed sketch of the Greytown harbor area and the precise delineation of the boundary line between the two countries. His ruling helped stabilize relations between Nicaragua and Costa Rica by providing a neutral and authoritative interpretation of the treaty. It was a testament to Alexander's ability to apply his military precision and engineering expertise to a diplomatic challenge. During his time in Central America, he also began writing his memoirs, which would later be published as Military Memoirs of a Confederate in 1907. If you're a student of history, a Civil War enthusiast, or just someone who loves a good story, reading both memoirs is like having a conversation with Alexander himself, one where he tells you what happened and then later what he really thought. Alexander passed away on April 28, 1910, at the age of 74 in Savannah, Georgia. He was buried in Magnolia Cemetery in Augusta, Georgia. Thanks for watching this episode of Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Like, follow, and click the bell for notifications to ensure you see all of the latest content. As always, let me know if there's any other important events of the American Civil War you would like me to address.